Stephen was part of a very wealthy family. His mother, Margaret Benson, was a millionaire thanks to her family's tobacco business. They lived in Naples, Florida, which is a fancy area full of big houses, fancy cars, and expensive lifestyles. The Bensons seemed like a perfect family to outsiders. Rich, influential, and living a life many people dream of. But like many families, the reality behind closed doors was very different. Stephen wasn't exactly the favorite child. His mother, Margaret, was the head of the family and controlled most of the money. She had expectations, and Stephen didn't live up to them. He was, in simple terms, kind of a disappointment in her eyes. His business ventures never seemed to work out, and while he was supposed to be managing certain family affairs, he wasn't particularly successful at it. Then there was Carol Lynn Benson Kendall, Stephen's sister. She was also part of this wealthy family but had her own life. She and Stephen weren't super close. You could describe their relationship as distant or even a bit competitive. The two siblings probably weren't each other's best friends, and there was an underlying tension between them, mostly because of money. Money was the root of many problems in the Benson family. Margaret, being the matriarch, controlled the family's fortune. This meant that Stephen's access to the family wealth depended entirely on his mother's decisions. He wasn't exactly broke, but he wasn't as financially secure as he would have liked to be. He probably felt like his future was uncertain as long as his mother controlled the purse strings. Inheritance became a key issue in the family, and you can imagine how someone like Stephen might start thinking about how much better life would be if he had full control over the family's wealth. Now let's talk about the day everything changed, the day of the bombing. On July 9th, 1985, it seemed like an ordinary summer day in Naples, Florida. The Benson family had plans to visit a plot of land where they intended to build a brand new family home. Imagine that scene for a moment. A seemingly happy, wealthy family, full of plans for the future, on a day trip to view the location of what was supposed to be the family's next big project. In the car were four people: Margaret Benson, the family matriarch who controlled the family's wealth; Stephen Benson, her son; Carol Lynn Benson Kendall, Stephen's sister; and Scott Benson, Stephen's younger brother. It was a typical family outing. They all piled into their family's Chevrolet Suburban, a vehicle big enough to comfortably fit them all. But nothing about this trip was going to be normal. As the family settled into the vehicle, everyone likely thought it was just another routine day. They had no idea that danger was lurking. As soon as Margaret, who was driving, turned on the ignition, the car didn't roar to life with the familiar sound of an engine. It was something much worse. A massive explosion rocked the Suburban. A bomb had been planted inside, and the second the car started, it detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. In an instant, the car was torn apart by the force of the blast. Margaret Benson, sitting behind the wheel, was killed instantly. Scott, who was seated in the back, was also killed in the explosion. It was over for them before they even had a chance to comprehend what was happening. The powerful explosion didn't just kill. It destroyed the vehicle and left behind a scene of utter devastation. Carol Lynn miraculously survived the blast, but not without injuries. She had been sitting in the front passenger seat, close to her mother. While the explosion must have been disorienting and terrifying, Carol managed to survive the ordeal. It's almost impossible to imagine what she experienced in those few moments. The shock of the blast, the confusion, the sudden loss of two of her closest family members. It's the kind of trauma that no one would ever expect to face. The aftermath of the explosion must have been pure chaos. Neighbors and passers-by would have heard the blast and likely rushed to the scene, not knowing what they would find. First responders arrived, but it was too late for Margaret and Scott. The explosion had been so devastating that there was nothing they could do for them. Carol, injured but alive, was taken to the hospital for treatment. The tragedy left everyone reeling. How could something like this happen? The shockwaves from that explosion weren't just physical. They extended to the entire community. The investigation into the bombing uncovered a lot of evidence that pointed directly at Stephen. One of the first things investigators did was look at the type of bomb used. It was a pipe bomb, a type of homemade explosive device that requires specific materials. Now, these materials don't just fall from the sky. They have to be bought from hardware stores and other places, and investigators traced the purchase of these materials to Stephen. It turned out that he had been buying items like pipes and explosives in the weeks leading up to the bombing. This was a major breakthrough. Not only did investigators have a bomb, but they now had a trail leading straight to Stephen. Then came witness testimonies. People who knew Stephen or had seen him in the days before and after the bombing started to report strange behavior. For example, someone saw him buying materials that could be used to make a bomb, and others noted that he seemed unusually calm and detached after the explosion. On top of all that, there was forensic evidence, the scientific stuff that linked Stephen to the crime. Forensic experts were able to analyze the remnants of the bomb and confirm that it had been built with materials Stephen purchased. The explosion wasn't random. It was carefully planned. Initially, there were some other theories, but they didn't hold up. For example, maybe this was a hit on the family by someone with a grudge. But the more investigators looked into it, the more it became clear that this wasn't the work of some random criminal. This was personal, and all the evidence pointed back to Stephen. One of the biggest questions in any murder case is, why? What could drive someone to kill their own family members? In Stephen Benson's case, the answer was simple: money. At the heart of this tragedy was the family's fortune. Margaret Benson had a substantial amount of wealth, and like most wealthy families, she had a will, a legal document that outlines who gets what when she dies. Margaret's will didn't favor Stephen as much as he might have liked. Although he stood to inherit some money, it wasn't the massive sum he had hoped for. His mother's plan was to divide the family fortune between him, Carol Lynn, and Scott. This meant Stephen wasn't going to get everything, and that probably frustrated him. At the time of the bombing, Stephen was also having financial troubles. His business ventures weren't doing well, and he likely had debts piling up. He needed money fast, and in his mind, his mother's death could solve all his problems. By eliminating her and Scott, he could secure a larger share of the inheritance and have access to the family wealth much sooner. The financial motive became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments during the trial. Stephen's greed and desperation for money led him to commit this heinous act. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a calculated decision to get rid of the people standing in the way of his financial security. When the case went to trial, Stephen Benson was charged with multiple crimes, including first-degree murder. The trial was highly publicized, with the media closely following every detail. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and people across the country were captivated by the story of a rich family torn apart by greed. The prosecution's case was solid. They had the physical evidence, witness testimonies, and forensic reports to back up their claims that Stephen was the mastermind behind the bombing. Their argument was simple: Stephen killed his family to get money. They showed how he had purchased the materials for the bomb and planned the entire event with cold calculation. The defense, of course, tried to cast doubt on the evidence. They argued that the case against Stephen was based on circumstantial evidence, meaning there wasn't a clear, direct link proving he set off the bomb. They also suggested that someone else could have been responsible, but this theory fell apart when faced with the overwhelming evidence. One of the most critical parts of the trial was the expert testimonies. Forensic experts explained how the bomb was made, linking it to Stephen. They described how the explosion happened and why the placement of the bomb indicated it was meant to kill everyone in the car. These experts were key in helping the jury understand the level of planning involved. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. Stephen Benson was guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Stephen Benson case was one of those rare incidents that sent shockwaves through the entire country, and not just because of the crime itself, but also because of who was involved: a wealthy, high-profile family. When people first heard the news, many couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that someone would kill their own mother and brother for financial gain. It wasn't just any act of violence. This was something cold-blooded, premeditated, and deeply rooted in greed. People tend to think of family as a safe haven, a place of love and loyalty. The thought that someone could destroy their own family for money challenged those very beliefs. The media coverage was intense, and for good reason. This wasn't just another crime story. It had all the elements that make a case captivating: wealth, power, betrayal, and murder. The press latched onto it, reporting every new detail as if it were a drama unfolding in real time. There were TV specials, front-page newspaper articles, and talk shows that discussed it for months on end. People couldn't stop talking about it because it felt like a real-life soap opera, except with devastating consequences. The public was not only curious, but deeply unsettled by the case, and it sparked conversations about trust, greed, and morality. The idea that someone from an affluent, respectable family could commit such a brutal act made it even more sensational. For Carol Lynn Benson Kendall, the impact was unimaginable. Losing her mother and brother in such a sudden, violent way would be hard for anyone to process. But for Carol, the pain was even more complicated because the person responsible for the deaths was her own brother. The psychological and emotional trauma of surviving an explosion that was meant to kill her, while knowing that her sibling had orchestrated it, is almost too much to comprehend. She had to navigate not only her grief, but also the betrayal of realizing her brother, someone she grew up with, was capable of such a heinous act. In the years following the case, Carol Lynn retreated from the public eye, and who could blame her? The spotlight brought by the media must have been overwhelming, and revisiting the trauma repeatedly through news reports and public speculation likely made her healing process even harder. Carol's choice to move away from the limelight was an attempt to find some peace and distance herself from the horror of what had happened. Unfortunately, the scars of such a betrayal don't heal easily, and it's likely that Carol carried that emotional burden for the rest of her life. The case also sparked broader conversations about family inheritance and the dark side of wealth. It raised uncomfortable but important questions. Can money really push someone to murder their own family? And sadly, the answer is yes. Wealth, especially large sums, can distort family dynamics. The promise of inheritance often brings out greed and entitlement in people who otherwise seem normal. In Stephen's case, the lure of inheriting his mother's fortune became more important than the lives of his family members. It wasn't just about financial security. It was about control and power, something that Stephen felt he deserved but wasn't getting. This case became a cautionary tale, reminding society that wealth, instead of bringing people together, can sometimes rip families apart. The Benson case didn't immediately lead to any legal changes regarding inheritance or family-related crimes, but it did make people more aware of the potential dangers lurking beneath seemingly happy, wealthy family facades. It prompted some families to re-examine how they handled estate planning, perhaps taking more care in how wills were written to avoid causing resentment or greed. People started to realize that while money can bring security and comfort, it can also lead to jealousy, competition, and sometimes even violence. Stephen Benson's psychological profile became a topic of interest during the investigation and trial. While there wasn't a detailed public psychological evaluation, experts did examine his behavior. What was clear from his actions was that he exhibited traits that are often associated with narcissism or sociopathy. He didn't seem to care about anyone but himself, and his cold, detached demeanor was alarming. Narcissism is when someone has an inflated sense of their own importance and a lack of empathy for others. In Stephen's case, his need for money and control seemed to outweigh any feelings of love or loyalty to his family. He didn't see his mother and siblings as family. He saw them as obstacles standing in the way of his financial success. Greed played a huge role in his decision to commit murder. He wasn't willing to wait for his mother to pass away naturally or accept a smaller inheritance. His sense of entitlement, combined with his financial desperation, led him to plan a horrifying crime. He likely convinced himself that this was the only way to secure his future, showing a total lack of morality or conscience.